but they'll have a wide open race too. Very unusual at the presidential level to have this degree of uncertainty and wide openness in both parties. It should be a very, very interesting election just to sort of see different candidates taking different positions, different points of view, looking for a champion and probably finding them. That's the way American politics often works. You know, that someone rises to the occasion and comes out of nowhere, Howard Dean in 2003, to embody a point of view that's not being represented by the other candidates. I think it's really a wide open election of a kind that I don't think we've ever had in our lifetimes here in D.C. I mean, this degree of volatility and unpredictability in both parties.
In my theory, we talked about this quickly beforehand, is that Hillary Clinton doesn't even run.
I think that's, you and I are in sync on this, which is we are much more skeptical than most people in Washington of whether it's so certain that Senator Clinton runs, of whether she really would be the front runner for the nomination if she did run, I think. I think both races are more wide open than people in Washington think. People in Washington are operating on the model of previous races. If you're ahead now, you kind of get the nomination. But I think that underrates the volatility of the situation, the number of issues in play, the war, immigration, Supreme Court picks conceivably. So I think McCain and Hillary Clinton, I guess if you had to bet right now, most people would say that will be the matchup. But I wouldn't be surprised if one or both of them don't get the nomination.
We'll go back to Denver. MJ O'Malley, next question.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you, Mr. Kristol, for joining us today.
Sure.
I want to talk a little bit, or ask you a little bit about military spending. I was reading up on the Project for a New American Century, and one of the points that they advocate, or that you as chairman advocate, is the increase of military spending. And obviously in 1997, when the organization was founded, that maybe was a little more practical or made sense for that time. But now in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan and the increase in military spending in the past few years, and the readjustment of priorities in regards to national security, there's been reported a great disparity between the funding in the military and education, as well as children's services. So many would argue that there's not adequate spending on education or children's services or other such programs or organizations in this country. So now coming up in November, as chairman of the Project for a New American Century, do you see a need for the change in Americans' priorities? And since there is an increase in criticism for the foreign policy, especially with Iraq and with the military spending, how do you envision this impacting the 2006 elections?
Well, I personally still think we're spending too little on the military. The truth is, given that we're fighting a war, we've done amazingly little to increase spending on the military, and most of the spending, the huge bulk of the increase, has gone to fighting the war, which is obviously necessary, but not to actually increasing the size of the military. We are conducting a post-9/11 foreign policy with a pre-9/11 size military. I think it's the single worst decision Bush or Rumsfeld made, not to increase by a couple of divisions the size of the military after 9/11. It's made us much less flexible, much less able to do some things in Iraq, or for that matter, incidentally, in Afghanistan, Sudan, and elsewhere, that would be easier to do if we had a larger military. We went down from about 2.1 million men and women under arms in the active army to about 1.45 million, I guess. Now we're at about just over 1.48, 1.5. We should be more like 1.6, 1.7, which we still will be way below what it was in 1990. And in terms of spending as a percentage of GDP, military spending remains low by historic standards, below the peacetime average from 1945 to 1990. So I remain a military spending hawk, I'm sorry to tell you. And here's an interesting factoid. I believe this is true. The spending on the education department under Bush has gone up by a higher percentage than spending than Defense Department spending. It's not true that we're starving the domestic programs. Bush has been a generous president. That's why a lot of conservative Republicans are unhappy with the Bush presidency and the Republican Congress. Finally, in the last year, they've slowed the growth of domestic spending. Entitlements have grown. The Medicare drug benefit is the biggest new entitlement in, 30 years, a huge amount. And so I think, I'm not necessarily against all that, but I don't think it's true that we're outspending, that we're spending too much on the military. I mean, it depends on what you think of the world we live in. And do we, is it a safe enough world to spend 4 cents of every dollar of our gross domestic product on the military, or should it be more like 5 cents? That's really what the debate comes to. And I think, given the dangers ahead, given the unpredictability of the world, given that you would like to be able to use troops, not just to remove dictators, but for peacekeeping and to stop genocide and all of this, and that you'd like to have a more robust State Department, better diplomacy, better intelligence, I would prefer to spend more on foreign and defense needs.
We're going to take a couple more questions, but I want to give you fair warning. I'm going to ask you before you leave to assess the political strengths and weaknesses of some past candidates for the White House, from Ronald Reagan to John Kerry to George W. Bush to Bill Clinton. So you can think about that. Let's go back to George Mason University. And Steve Klein, a couple of questions from your folks.
Sure, Steve. Like Pace in Denver, we have a lot of questions. Patrick Delaney.
Yes, hi, Mr. Kristol. My name is Patrick Delaney. I'm a junior political communications major from Winter Park, Colorado. I kind of want to go back to what you were talking about Bush saying setting the trap on September 6th with his reframing of interrogation techniques. How dangerous is the trap that we're setting by kind of looking past the protections that are set forth in the Geneva Conventions, also in our decision to go to Iraq, kind of looking past the checks and balances set in place by the UN and choosing to disregard the general consensus of the UN? How dangerous is that trap that we're getting ourselves into in terms of future foreign policy?
Yeah, I don't think very dangerous at all. I mean, we've fought many wars in our history, and none of them was blessed by the UN, except, I guess, the Gulf War of 1990-91. And I guess the Korean War was, because the Soviets took a holiday from the Security Council. It didn't really matter. You know, we should fight wars when it's just and necessary to fight them, and we shouldn't fight when it's not just and necessary. And I don't give the UN a huge amount of credibility or deference in making that determination. If it's right to go into the Sudan and stop genocide, we should not do it because the Chinese are buying oil from Sudan and will veto something in the Security Council. In terms of the Geneva Conventions, it is a fairly technical and complicated issue. Bush had to do something because of the Hamdan decision, which I personally think was wrongly decided, but you know, that's why we have a Supreme Court. They decide, not me, and it was a 5-3 decision. He had to figure out how to deal with the treatment of terrorists who are not covered, as POWs are, by the Geneva Conventions, but for who are covered by, the court decided, by this, what's it called, Common Article 3. And then the question is, how do you sort of specify what isn't permitted in the interrogation of these people? It's a pretty narrow issue, and I honestly don't think it compromises the basic Geneva Conventions or our moral credibility in the world.
We'll stay with GMU. Next question.
Thank you. Mohammed Syed.
Hello, my name is Mohammed Syed. I'm a senior here at Mason, major in journalism and concentration. My question was, you commented earlier about freedom of speech, like in Islam. Are people less sensitive, do you believe, towards Islam and the criticism of Islam?
Yeah, I don't know. I think they're probably less. I mean, certainly after 9/11, Bush, to his credit, went out of his way to not make this a religious war and to make clear that it was not a war with Islam, it was not a religious war, it was not a clash of civilizations, it was a war with terrorists. He got criticized by some people for saying, well, it's a war on terrorism. That's an imprecise term. But I think one reason he wanted to use that term was that he didn't want to give it a kind of particular religious connotation. The truth is we're fighting a virulent subspecies, if you will, that happens in Islam, or that's taken over a little part of Islam, or let's say claims to speak in the name of Islam. There have been Christian fascists in the world, and we've certainly, in the past, and we've certainly fought them. We might have to fight them again. We fought Milosevic in the Balkans on behalf of Bosnia and Kosovo, which I guess are mostly Islamic Muslim countries, and we were right to fight Milosevic. So I don't, for me, it's not a matter of one religion or another. I do think, and I say this, you know, as a concern, I mean, I'm worried about this, that the more we get the reactions of the kind that you're seeing to the Danish cartoons or to the Pope's speech, regardless of whether those were, you know, that speech was perfect or anything like that, people will start here. There'll be kind of a backlash. The student mentioned a backlash earlier. There could be a backlash against Islam more broadly. There hasn't been. It's very much to the credit of America, of the United States. They were fighting, we fought in Afghanistan, we're fighting in Iraq. And really, you know, people here at home remain, I think, tolerant and pluralistic and open-minded. But I would worry, I mean, people should be careful not to ascribe what they see in some of these riots in the streets and obviously these terrible individual cases of murder or whatever to the religion as a whole. And I think, frankly, it's important for moderate Muslims, for those who speak for the civilized mainstream of Islam, to denounce and detach themselves, obviously, from these extremists, just as, you know, it was important for Jews around the world to denounce Baruch Goldstein when he went in and murdered 29 Arabs in was that 1994 or something like that in the West Bank. So it's not my fault that he did that, and it's not the fault of any Muslim here, obviously, that others are claiming to speak in the name of Islam and doing terrible things. But I think one wants to be careful to separate out the extremists from the mainstream.
We have about 5 minutes left, so let's real quickly go back to Pace University. One more question from your group, Chris Malone.
Thanks, Steve. Alexandria Velez has our last question here.
Hi, Bill. I had a question in reference to when you were on Fox News suggesting that the people of Iran would embrace the U.S. attack, triggering a regime change. You had earlier stated a few days before the Iraq war that we are tempted to comment in these last days before the war on the UN and the French and the Democrats. But the war itself will clarify who is right and who is wrong about weapons of mass destruction. It will reveal the aspirations of the people of Iraq and expose the truth about Saddam's regime. Now, later in the interview, you had also stated how Iraq and Iran are very different, but that the Iranian people dislike their regime. You think they would be the right use of targeted military force, but especially if political pressure before we use military force could cause them to reconsider whether they really want to have this regime in power. Now, my question is, can you elaborate on why they need our political pressures and military forces as they're awakening for reconsidering regime change when you already stated how much they dislike it, similar to what has been said about the Iraqi people before we attacked?
Well, I think the Iraqi people remain grateful that we removed Saddam Hussein, a horrible dictator. Now, unfortunately, we haven't provided good security in Iraq, and there's been a terrible insurgency, and the Sunnis were much more resistant to working with Shia and Kurds than we expected, and then the Sunni insurgency has now triggered a Shia sectarian sort of counter violence, which is dangerous, and which we should do a better job, I would hope, of helping the Iraqis who want to live together get under control. So, I mean, I was partly right and partly wrong about Iraq, I would say, but, you know, an awful lot of Iraqis voted 3 times in 2005, and I think they remain committed to democracy if they can make it work. It would be terrible if the extremists on both sides destroyed that young democracy. On Iran, I don't think it's an easy call. I don't know obviously, with any certainty, how Iranians would react to a military strike on nuclear targets. I hope we don't get to that. But I don't think it's out of the question at all that a lot of them think the current regime is leading them down a terrible path. And if such a strike sort of, you know, caused a crisis in that regime, I think there are lots of Iranians who would prefer a much less aggressive, much more tolerant regime, the kind that Iran deserves. So no one can guarantee anything when you take military action, and I didn't mean to guarantee anything, but I don't think it's clear that targeted military strikes, for example, would lead to an upsurge of radicalism in Iran. It might also lead to a sense that the radicals who are currently running Iran have taken the current country down the wrong path.
Deb Longworth in Denver, you have a question?
Good afternoon, Mr. Kristol. I'm so glad you could join us today. First of all, I wanted to tell you, I greatly admire you not indulging in some of the flaming, vitriolic rhetoric that people like Ann Coulter or Michael Moore, for example, go after. It seems to be very well modulated and well reasoned. So my question to you is, when you are reading about say the progressive ideas or moderate authors, who do you look to for your information, and who would you suggest that we read for the same thing?
Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a good question. No, I don't know.
Read the Weekly Standard.
Yeah, read them. Well, maybe you should read the New Republic and the Nation on the progressive side. I don't know. The Nation's slightly less, slightly more hysterical sometimes, but there's some smart people there. I mean, I guess there's so many liberal writers, you know, so many of the major media have mostly liberal writers, I would say, that I haven't thought that much about individual ones who I would recommend. Certainly here in Washington, we read E.J. Dionne in the Washington Post, Richard Cohen in the Washington Post. I think the Washington Post editorial page is actually a particularly interesting and intelligent, moderate liberal, sometimes contrarian voice. I think much better, frankly, for example, than the New York Times. You know, what I've been encouraged, my kids are college age, a couple of them, what I've encouraged them to do is go to Real Clear Politics, which is a website, realclearpolitics.com. I'm giving them a free ad here, which prints every morning and every late afternoon, about a dozen, I'd say, op-eds and magazine articles from both sides of the political spectrum, and some that are just non-ideological. And I think if you just do that for a while, actually, you begin to figure out who you like and who you find interesting, and you get a good sampling of arguments about the major issues of the day. So, I mean, there are many other websites too, but I think that one in particular gives you most of the major opinion columnists and a lot of excerpts from the major opinion magazines.
Our last question will come from George Mason University, appropriately enough. Go ahead, Steve Klein.
Ronell?
Hello, Mr. Kristol. My name is Ronell Cristobal. I'm a government and international politics major.